Well, the meltdown of supply chains during the pandemic exposed a serious threat. One of America's greatest adversaries controls the critical elements to key U.S. industries. The solution? Bring the supply chains home. While the cost is high, our national security depends on it. Caitlin Burke brings us the story.
The elements needed for some of the most commonly used technologies in the world today are relatively abundant in the Earth's crust, including here in the United States. But when it comes to the global supply chain, it's almost entirely controlled by China.
China produces about 65% of global rare earth mining, some 85% of processing, and about 90%, or a little bit above that, of the actual magnets that we use in our devices every day.
As the relationship between Beijing and Washington seems to crumble, demand for tech that relies on rare earth elements is only building.
Rare earth materials are 17 elements on the periodic table, so it's not just one element. And they're used for all sorts of applications across modern life. But what they are really essential for in the context of today's world is they are used to produce the highest strength magnets that power electric motors and generators of all kinds. Everything from electric vehicles to wind turbines to drones, robots, and some of the most advanced weapon systems that keep us safe for defense applications.
Relying on the country seen as the greatest threat to both U.S. prosperity and national security is an obvious problem. And experts believe the solution is even more obvious.
We were a leading producer of these before, we can do so again.
Early companies in the United States pioneered some of the most cutting-edge compounds for rare earth magnets. However, like many of the strategic supply chains we're now so focused on onshoring, beginning in the 1980s and 90s, we largely offshored this industries because the United States decided to specialize in other areas.
In 2017, owners of MP Materials bought an abandoned mine in the Mojave Desert. Their goal? Use it to create a complete magnetic supply chain. In less than a decade, they've almost accomplished it with the Mountain Pass mine, now the largest rare earth mine in the United States.
Today, we produce around 15% of the global rare earth content. But what we need to bring back to America, and what we are in progress of bringing home, is the ability to refine those materials domestically and then to produce the metals, alloys, and magnets themselves.
Matt Slosher, Senior Vice President of Communications and Policy at MP Materials, says the company is moving full steam ahead on the final steps of this supply chain. The project has the support of both the public and private sectors. Back in 2021, General Motors agreed to buy the magnets produced for use in their electric vehicles. The Department of Defense is also interested, investing $10 million in 2020 and another $35 million in 2022.
In order to create energy security in the United States, we need to have commercial scale champions that can feed into our large manufacturers. And that will provide commercial resiliency, and it will also enable us to ensure that the defense needs are met.
Creating this kind of supply chain here has bipartisan support. Frank Fannon, former Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, says the Trump administration also backed the project.
In the case of MP Materials, we were very supportive of some of their work. You know, they actually had a Chinese investor who had a significant investment. And we worked with MP and were very supportive of their outreach to other investors to effectively dilute the ownership stake of the Chinese interests, so much so that they exited the board.
Fannon sees China essentially operating as a cartel when it comes to its control over the rare earth industry. Case in point, recently moving toward banning exports.
They announced that they intend to restrict the export of rare earth element technology to other countries and restrict other countries to be able to basically compete with them in the rare earth space.
These minerals will also play a significant role in the U.S. clean energy transition. With demand expected to triple over the next decade, Fannon says both the federal government and the corporate sector must stop undermining U.S. strength and security by continuing to turn to China for cheap, clean energy goods.
They're seeking to create and are the dominant supplier to meet the West's environmental objectives. The Chinese have been using our values against us as a weakness. I believe if we mobilize them, it can be a strength in terms of the marketplace.
Fannon says it's imperative the U.S. fully commit now to building the clean, secure, and resilient supply chains needed in the future, a future that must not rely on China. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Well, I hope this is a cause that both parties, Democrat, Republican, can get behind to say it's in our strategic interest. And whether you're talking about rare earths or pharmaceuticals, that's another one that China seems to have monopoly power over. One thing that's been happening, and maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but China's been going around the world offering bonds to governments so that they can build port facilities that they will then operate and pay back the bonds from the fees from the port. That may seem like a wonderful thing, and if you're a government and going, well, you're going to give me a free port, yes, sign me up. But what is lost in this exchange is the incredible amount of information that you're going to get about the economy, particularly the export of economy of any country where you control that port. It's a strategic advantage. China has been acting very strategically for decades. They point to our democracy and say, well, that's actually a fundamental weakness because you're spending your time and all of your energy on these ideological fights and you're missing the strategic thrust to the future. They aren't missing it. They actually train their leaders over decades in how to think strategically and what is in the best long-term interest of China. In our politics today, and particularly the negative campaigning that seems to be so effective, we've lost sight of that. I hope you and I, as voters, resolve that we're going to resist that. How do we elect competent leaders who think strategically and think in the long term? I'm talking 20, 30, 40, 50-year long-term interest of the United States. It's up to us, we the people, to do this. So let's resolve, yes, we're going to be educated voters. We want to choose people who can actually